The enemy put a $10,000 bounty on his head, but the jungle swallowed him free. April 24, 1969. The Huey helicopters dropped down through humid air into Cambodia, a country where American forces officially did not exist. Master Sergeant Jerry Michael Shriver was about to launch his final mission, a raid on what military intelligence believed was the enemy's central headquarters in Southeast Asia. 3 weeks from rotation home. 3 weeks from walking away from the most dangerous job in the Vietnam War. But Jerry Shriver had never been good at walking away. This is the story of Mad Dog Shriver, the Special Forces legend who became a battlefield ghost. The man Radio Hanoi wanted dead so badly they announced his bounty to the entire country. And the warrior who disappeared into the jungle on a spring day in Cambodia, leaving behind a mystery that even the Pentagon cannot solve. Was he killed in action and lost to the chaos of combat? Or did he survive long enough to fall into enemy hands, his fate sealed behind prison walls that American intelligence would never penetrate? By the time Jerry Shriver vanished, he had already become something more than human in the minds of both his comrades and his enemies. He was a ghost story told in bunkers, a name whispered in North Vietnamese camps, the subject of intelligence reports that circulated through Hanoi trying to identify and eliminate the American causing catastrophic damage along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. To understand how one man became such a legend requires understanding the war he fought, a war that never officially happened. The Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group sounds like a research organization. The acronym MACV-SOG sounds military but unremarkable. That was exactly the point. MACV-SOG was neither a study group nor an observation unit. It was the most classified American military operation of the Vietnam War, a Joint Service High Command Unconventional Warfare Task Force that conducted strategic reconnaissance and direct action missions in areas where American forces were officially forbidden to operate: Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam itself. The men of MACV-SOG did not wear standard uniforms. They carried weapons with filed-off serial numbers. They used sterile equipment that could not be traced back to American supply chains. When they died, their families were often told they had been killed in South Vietnam, hundreds of miles from where they actually fell. The casualty rates were staggering. Some reconnaissance teams operating across the fence, the term for crossing into denied territory, suffered casualty rates exceeding 100% over the course of a year, meaning the entire team would be wounded or killed and replaced, sometimes multiple times. These were not large unit operations. A typical reconnaissance team consisted of 2 or 3 American Special Forces soldiers and 4 to 9 indigenous troops, usually Montagnard tribesmen or ethnic Vietnamese who had their own reasons for fighting. These small teams would insert by helicopter into hostile territory, sometimes hundreds of kilometers from friendly forces, and conduct surveillance on enemy troop movements, base camps, and supply routes. When they were discovered, and they often were, extraction became a desperate race between American helicopters fighting through ground fire and enemy troops converging on their position. Jerry Shriver volunteered for this. He was born in 1941 in California, joined the Army in 1958 at just 17 years old, and volunteered for Special Forces in 1962. By 1968, he was on his 3rd tour in Vietnam and had become one of the most experienced reconnaissance team leaders in MACV-SOG. He ran missions out of Command and Control North, the launch site near the demilitarized zone that handled operations into the most dangerous areas of Laos and North Vietnam. But experience alone does not explain the legend. Other men ran just as many missions. Other team leaders had just as much combat time. What set Jerry Shriver apart was how he fought and how he lived. Or more accurately, how he seemed to have stopped caring about whether he lived at all. The veterans who served with him describe a man who had crossed some invisible line between courage and something else entirely. He would volunteer for missions other team leaders considered suicidal. He spent as little time as possible in the relative safety of the base, constantly pushing to get back across the fence. When his teams made contact with enemy forces, Shriver had a reputation for moving toward the gunfire rather than seeking cover or calling for extraction. One Special Forces officer who served in MACV-SOG described Shriver as the bravest man he ever met and also the most dangerous to be around, not because Shriver endangered his own men, but because his appetite for combat seemed to have no limit. Another veteran recalled that Shriver seemed to prefer being in hostile territory to being safe, as if the jungle across the fence had become more home than any base or barracks. The indigenous troops who served with Shriver gave him nicknames in their own languages that all translated roughly the same way, variations on mad or crazy or without fear. The Americans shortened it to Mad Dog. Shriver himself seemed aware of his reputation and cultivated it. He grew his hair longer than regulations permitted. He wore a headband and carried a sawed-off shotgun along with his other weapons. Some accounts describe him carrying a tomahawk. In an era when special forces were already considered unconventional, Shriver stood out as extreme even among extremes. The North Vietnamese noticed. Radio Hanoi, the propaganda broadcast service of North Vietnam, began making references to an American special operations soldier operating along the border regions who was causing significant casualties and disrupting operations. Intelligence reports from Hanoi referenced efforts to identify and target this individual. And then came the bounty. According to multiple SOG veterans, Radio Hanoi announced a reward of $10,000 for the American Special Forces soldier known as Mad Dog. $10,000 in 1969 would be worth approximately $80,000 today. An extraordinary sum and an unprecedented individual bounty in a war where the enemy typically focused on unit designations rather than individual soldiers. The bounty was both recognition and threat. It meant Shriver had become enough of a problem that Hanoi wanted him specifically eliminated. It meant enemy forces along the border had been instructed to watch for him, to prioritize his capture or death. For most soldiers, such a bounty would be terrifying confirmation that they had become a marked man. For Shriver, according to those who knew him, it was validation. One story captures the essence of Mad Dog Shriver better than any other, a radio exchange that became legendary within Special Forces circles. During a mission in Laos, Shriver's reconnaissance team was discovered by enemy forces and quickly found itself in heavy contact. As North Vietnamese troops maneuvered to surround the small American position, another team operating in the area picked up Shriver's radio transmission requesting extraction. The team leader radioed to Shriver that his position was being surrounded and he needed to break contact immediately. Shriver's response entered Special Forces folklore. "No," he transmitted back. "I've got them right where I want them." Surrounded from the inside, then he led an assault directly into the enemy force. Whether this story is perfectly accurate or has been embellished over decades of retelling is impossible to verify. But the fact that it was told, repeated, and believed by the men who served in MACV SOG tells you everything about who Jerry Shriver was, or at least who he had become by 1969. By April of that year, Shriver was a master sergeant, the highest enlisted rank, with multiple tour and countless missions across the fence. He was assigned to command and control South, the MACV SOG launch site that handled operations into Cambodia. And he had approximately 3 weeks left before his scheduled rotation back to the United States. 3 weeks to survive. The mission that would seal his fate was not a standard reconnaissance patrol. It was a hatchet force operation, a larger unit designed for direct action rather than pure surveillance. Where a reconnaissance team might be 6 to 12 men, a hatchet force could be 30 to 40. A substantial force by MACV SOG standards, but still small compared to conventional infantry operations. The target was significant, COSVN, the Central Office for South Vietnam, essentially the mobile headquarters from which Hanoi directed its military and political operations in the South. American intelligence had been hunting for COSVN throughout the war. It was believed to move frequently, operating from base camps in the Cambodian border regions where American ground forces were officially not permitted to pursue. Intelligence reports in April 1969 suggested COSVN was operating in Kampong Cham Province, Cambodia, roughly 70 kilometers northwest of Saigon. A raid on such a target would be high value and high risk. This was not border area reconnaissance. This was a deep penetration strike into a sanctuary the enemy considered safe. Jerry Shriver volunteered to go. There are conflicting accounts about whether Shriver was specifically assigned to the mission or whether he pushed to be included. Some sources suggest his command was reluctant to send him, concerned that after so many missions and so many close calls, his luck was running out. Other accounts indicate that by this point in his service, Shriver had essentially become impossible to keep off missions, that telling him to stand down for his own safety would be met with a request for transfer to any unit that would let him continue operating. One officer who served in Command and Control South described being worried about Shriver in the weeks before the Cambodia mission. Not worried that Shriver was incapable or unreliable, but worried that he had crossed into a psychological space where the normal survival instinct had been replaced by something else. Soldiers talk about the 1,000-yard stare, the look in the eyes of men who have seen too much combat. Shriver had that, but according to those who knew him, it was not the stare of trauma. It was the look of a man who belonged in combat more than anywhere else, who had found his purpose in the most terrible place imaginable. Whether the command should have grounded Shriver for psychological reasons is a question without a good answer. This was MACV SOG in 1969. Every man running missions across the fence was dealing with extraordinary stress. The luxury of months of rest and psychological counseling did not exist. You ran missions until you rotated home or until you did not come back. April 24, 1969 was Jerry Shriver's last day to come back. The hatchet force inserted by helicopter into Kampong Cam province in the morning. The landing zone was supposed to be cold, military terminology for undefended. Intelligence had assessed the area as suitable for insertion with minimal enemy presence in the immediate vicinity of the landing zone. Intelligence was wrong. The helicopters had barely touched down when the hatchet force came under immediate and heavy fire. This was not a chance encounter with a small enemy patrol. This was a prepared ambush by a large force that had either been waiting at that specific location or was close enough to respond within seconds of the helicopter landing. The tactical situation deteriorated instantly. Instead of offloading in an orderly manner and forming a defensive perimeter, the hatchet force was fighting from the moment boots hit the ground. The volume of fire indicated a force substantially larger than the American unit, possibly company strength or larger, with automatic weapons and good positioning. This was every helicopter insertion's nightmare scenario, landing directly into an ambush with enemy forces close enough to engage before you can establish any defensive position. The team leaders immediately called for extraction. There would be no raid on COSVN. There would be no movement to the target. The mission had become pure survival, get as many men back on the helicopters as possible and get out before the enemy overran the landing zone completely. In the chaos of fire and movement, Jerry Shriver was seen moving toward the tree line. Multiple witnesses reported seeing him advancing in the direction of the heaviest enemy fire. This was consistent with his reputation and his past behavior. Where other soldiers would seek cover or fall back to a more defensible position, Shriver moved forward. Some accounts suggest he was providing covering fire to allow other team members to reach the extraction helicopters. Others indicate he was attempting to assault the enemy position directly, either to create an opening for withdrawal or simply because that was what Jerry Shriver did. The last radio contact with Shriver came minutes after insertion. His transmission indicated he was in heavy contact. Then his radio went silent. The extraction helicopters fought through ground fire to pull out as many of the hatchet force as possible. Pilots pushed their aircraft to the limit, hovering under fire while soldiers scrambled aboard. Door gunners laid down suppressing fire. Fast movers, jet aircraft, were called in to strafe the enemy positions. The extraction was a desperate, violent scramble to get out alive. When the helicopters cleared the landing zone and conducted accountability, Jerry Shriver was not on board. Attempts to re-establish radio contact failed. Calls on the emergency frequency received no response. Aerial reconnaissance over the landing zone showed continuing enemy activity and no sign of Shriver. The level of enemy ground fire made an immediate ground search impossible. The hatchet force had been lucky to extract with the casualties they had. Going back in immediately would risk additional losses with almost no chance of success. The decision was made to classify Jerry Michael Shriver as missing in action. That was April 24, 1969. Jerry Shriver was 27 years old. He had been 3 weeks from rotation home, and then he disappeared into one of the great mysteries of the Vietnam War. Missing in action is a category that carries hope and agony in equal measure. It means a service member's status is unknown, not confirmed dead, not confirmed captured, unknown. For families, it means years or decades of uncertainty, of waiting for information that may never come. For the military, it triggers ongoing search and investigation efforts. For the men who served with the missing, it means living with questions that have no answers. The immediate search efforts for Jerry Shriver were hampered by the same factors that made MACV SOG operations so dangerous. The location where he disappeared was in Cambodia, officially neutral territory where large American ground operations were not authorized. The area was heavily controlled by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces. Reconnaissance flights could observe from the air but could not confirm what had happened on the ground. Intelligence officers reviewed all available information. They interviewed the survivors of the Hatchet Force mission. They examined radio transcripts and after-action reports. They requested any signals intelligence that might indicate enemy communications referencing an American prisoner. They ran the same process they ran for every MIA case, trying to determine whether the missing service member was killed in action, captured, evading, and attempting to return to friendly forces, or had deserted, though desertion was essentially inconceivable in this case. The evidence pointed in multiple directions. Shriver had last been seen moving toward heavy enemy fire in an area that was being overrun. He had gone silent on the radio. No subsequent radio transmissions or emergency beacons had been detected. These facts suggested he had been killed in action, either in the initial contact or shortly thereafter, and his body had been lost in the jungle during the chaotic extraction. But there was no body, no confirmation, and that left room for other possibilities. Within weeks of Shriver's disappearance, new information began to surface, but it was information that raised more questions than it answered. Hanoi Hana, the nickname American forces gave to the English-language propaganda broadcasts from North Vietnam, made references to the capture of American Special Forces soldiers in Cambodia. The broadcasts were notoriously unreliable, mixing accurate information with complete fabrications designed to demoralize American troops and audience back home. But intelligence analysts listened carefully to every broadcast because occasionally the propaganda contained verifiable facts that confirmed other intelligence. Some veterans and researchers have claimed that Hanoi Hana specifically referenced Mad Dog Shriver by name as having been captured. The problem with this claim is documentation. The broadcasts were not systematically recorded or transcribed, at least not in archives that are publicly accessible. Memory is unreliable, especially memory of radio broadcasts heard over 50 years ago in a war zone. What is certain is that propaganda broadcasts made references to captured American soldiers in the time period after Shriver's disappearance. Whether those references specifically named Shriver or were later conflated with his case by hopeful listeners is impossible to verify definitively. Then there were the POW reports. Throughout the Vietnam War and for decades afterward, the intelligence community collected reports from refugees, defectors, and other sources claiming to have information about American prisoners of war. Some of these reports were credible and led to confirmed identifications. Many were well-intentioned but mistaken. Some were fabrications by individuals hoping for reward money or resettlement assistance. Several reports surfaced in the years after 1969 from individuals claiming to have seen or heard about an American prisoner, matching Shriver's description being held in Cambodia, or moved through the prison system toward North Vietnam. These reports described a tall American with long hair who was being held separately from other prisoners and was considered a high-value captive. The Defense Intelligence Agency, which handled POW-related intelligence, investigated every report. Some could be dismissed as obviously false, descriptions that did not match Shriver, timelines that made no sense, sources that were proven fabricators. Others remained unresolved, neither confirmed nor disproven, simply added to the file of uncertain information. None of the reports led to Shriver's recovery. As the years passed and the war continued, the likelihood of finding Jerry Shriver alive decreased. The Paris Peace Accords in 1973 included provisions for the return of all American prisoners of war. When North Vietnam released its prisoners during Operation Homecoming, Jerry Shriver was not among them. His name was not on any list provided by Hanoi. No returning prisoner reported having seen him or heard credible information about his fate. For the Shriver family, this was devastating. For as long as Jerry was classified as missing in action, there was hope however slim that he might still be alive. When all the acknowledged prisoners came home and he was not among them, that hope collapsed into a different kind of uncertainty. If he was not a prisoner, then he was almost certainly dead. But without remains, without confirmation, the word almost carried unbearable weight. On June 10, 1974, more than 5 years after Jerry Shriver disappeared, the military made a presumptive finding of death. This is a legal and administrative determination made when a service member has been missing for an extended period, and the evidence suggests death is the most likely outcome, even without remains or confirmation. It allows families to receive death benefits, to hold memorial services, to begin the process of grieving with some measure of closure. But a presumptive finding of death is not the same as confirmation. It is the military's way of saying, based on all available evidence and the passage of time, we believe this person is deceased, even though we cannot prove it conclusively. Jerry Michael Shriver's status was officially changed from missing in action to killed in action, body not recovered. His name was added to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., Panel 01 East, Line 134, among the more than 58,000 Americans who died in Southeast Asia. But unlike most names on that wall, Jerry Shriver's death remained unconfirmed. His remains were never recovered. No witness ever came forward with definitive evidence of how or when he died. The jungle and the fog of war had swallowed him completely. Which brings us to the central question that has haunted researchers, veterans, and his family for more than half a century. What actually happened to Jerry Shriver on April 24, 1969? There are two primary theories, each supported by some evidence, neither conclusively proven. Theory 1, Jerry Shriver was killed in action during the initial contact or shortly thereafter. He was moving toward enemy positions under heavy fire. He went silent on the radio. In the chaos of the ambush and extraction, his body was left behind. The North Vietnamese either buried him in an unmarked grave, left his body in the jungle where it decomposed and scattered, or moved his remains to a location that was never identified. This theory is supported by the tactical situation, the overwhelming enemy force, the fact that no credible POW sighting was ever confirmed, and the reality that many MACV-SOG personnel killed in Laos and Cambodia were never recovered due to the remote and hostile locations where they died. Theory 2, Jerry Shriver survived the initial contact, either wounded or overwhelmed by enemy forces, and was captured. He was taken prisoner and held in Cambodia or moved through the prison system. He either died in captivity before the war ended, was executed by his captors, or was among the prisoners that Hanoi did not acknowledge and did not release. This theory is supported by the propaganda broadcast references, the unconfirmed POW reports, the $10,000 bounty suggesting the enemy wanted him alive for intelligence or propaganda value, and the fact that his body was never found on the battlefield. If you forced intelligence analysts to assign probabilities, most would say Theory 1 is more likely. The tactical situation strongly suggests Shriver was killed in action. The lack of any confirmed sighting during Operation Homecoming suggests he did not survive to be repatriated. The statistical reality is that most missing in action cases from Vietnam, when eventually resolved, turn out to be battlefield deaths where remains were lost due to the environment, not cases of prisoners held in secret. But probability is not certainty. MACV-SOG operations were so highly classified that full documentation of casualties and operations did not exist in many cases. Cambodia was a black hole for intelligence during this period. The North Vietnamese did not operate their prison system with anything resembling Geneva Convention accountability. There are documented cases of American POWs who were held in Cambodia and Laos, and who were never acknowledged by Hanoi, only identified decades later through remains recovery efforts. Could Jerry Shriver have been captured and held in a remote prison camp in Cambodia where he died of wounds or disease or execution? Yes. Could his captors have chosen not to acknowledge his capture because of his reputation and the damage he had inflicted on their forces? Yes. Could the propaganda references have been accurate even if no returning prisoner could confirm them, simply because Shriver was held separately? Yes. But could is not the same as did. The Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, the organization responsible for searching for and recovering missing American service members, lists Jerry Michael Shriver's case as unresolved. His remains have never been identified. Investigations have continued for decades. Teams have traveled to Southeast Asia to interview sources, search former battle sites, and excavate potential burial locations. None of these efforts have produced definitive evidence regarding Shriver's fate. In 2004, a joint field investigation team conducted a search in the area where Shriver disappeared. They interviewed local villagers, some of whom remembered the battle and remembered seeing American forces inserted by helicopter. Some claim to remember seeing bodies afterward, but memories after 35 years are unreliable, and no physical evidence was recovered that could be linked to Shriver. The most likely scenario, based on all available evidence, is that Jerry Shriver was killed during or shortly after the initial ambush on April 24, 1969, and his body was never recovered from the battlefield. This is the conclusion reflected in the official presumptive finding of death. This is the outcome that best fits the tactical evidence. But the most likely scenario is not the only possible scenario, and that distinction matters. For the Shriver family, uncertainty is its own kind of torture. Knowing a loved one died in combat is devastating, but it provides a form of closure. Not knowing, living with possibilities and maybes and unconfirmed reports, makes true grieving almost impossible. Every few years, a new lead would emerge, a researcher claiming new evidence, a supposed witness coming forward, and the wound would reopen. For the Special Forces community, Jerry Shriver became something more than a missing comrade. He became a symbol of the sacrifice and secrecy of MACV SOG operations, of the warriors who crossed the fence into denied territory and fought in a war that was not acknowledged. Every year at Special Forces gatherings, his name is spoken, stories are told, the legend grows, and legends, by their nature, resist simple explanations. Mad Dog Shriver stories have proliferated over the decades since his disappearance. Some are certainly true, some are embellished, some are probably fabricated, but they persist because Jerry Shriver represented something essential about a particular kind of warrior, the soldier who does not just accept danger but seems to seek it, who finds purpose and clarity in combat that he cannot find anywhere else, who becomes more effective and more dangerous the closer he gets to death. There is a photograph of Jerry Shriver that circulates in Special Forces circles and online. It shows a young man with long hair, a headband, and an expression that is hard to read. Not quite smiling, not quite serious. The eyes are striking, intense, and distant at the same time. It looks exactly like what you would expect a soldier nicknamed Mad Dog to look like, and that is part of why the image has become iconic. But photographs are just moments frozen in time. They do not tell you what a person was thinking or feeling. They do not explain how a 17-year-old kid from California became a battlefield legend. They do not answer what happens to a man's psychology after years of running missions into hostile territory, after watching teammates die, after killing more enemy soldiers than most people can imagine, after Radio Hanoi puts a bounty on your head. What do you become when the war becomes your identity? Some veterans who served in MACV SOG have talked publicly about the difficulty of readjusting to normal life after their tour ended. The intensity of cross-border operations, the constant adrenaline, the hyper-awareness required to survive in denied territory, all of that creates a psychological state that does not easily reverse when you get on a plane home. Many struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Many self-medicated with alcohol or retreated into isolation. Some never really left the jungle, not psychologically. Would Jerry Shriver have struggled with that transition if he had made it home? Almost certainly. By April 1969, he had spent years living at the extreme edge of human experience. Going back to a normal life, a normal job, a normal relationship with fear and risk and purpose might have been impossible. There is something deeply tragic about a warrior so adapted to war that peace becomes unbearable. One Special Forces veteran who knew Shriver said years later that part of him was not surprised that Mad Dog did not come home. Not because Shriver was suicidal, but because the jungle had claimed him long before that final mission. He belonged there. He had become part of the war in a way that made separation impossible. When he disappeared on April 24, 1969, he had already been gone for years. That is the most haunting aspect of the Jerry Shriver story. Not just that he vanished without a trace, but that in some fundamental way he had been disappearing for a long time, becoming a ghost while he was still alive. Today, more than 50 years after Jerry Shriver walked into Cambodia and never came back, his story continues to fascinate and disturb in equal measure. Books about MACV-SOG devote chapters to him. Documentaries interview surviving veterans who tell the same stories. The Surrounded from the Inside radio call, the $10,000 bounty, the warrior who seemed to have no fear. The Defense POW-MIA accounting agency still considers his case active. If new evidence emerges, if remains are discovered that can be tested with modern forensic technology, if a former enemy soldier comes forward with credible information, the investigation will continue. This is the promise America makes to those who serve. We will never stop looking. But realistically, after more than 5 decades, the chances of a definitive resolution are vanishingly small. The jungle and time have erased whatever evidence might have existed. The witnesses are dying. The battlefields have been reclaimed by vegetation and development. Whatever happened to Jerry Shriver in those final moments has been lost to history. So we are left with the legend. Mad Dog Shriver, the man with a $10,000 enemy bounty on his head. The warrior who said he had the enemy surrounded from the inside. The Special Forces sergeant who volunteered for one more mission when he should have been preparing to go home. And we are left with the question that has no answer. Was he killed in the initial ambush, his body lost to the jungle and the fog of war, a battlefield death like so many others, exceptional only in the identity of the warrior who fell? Or did he survive long enough to be captured, to become a prisoner whose fate was never acknowledged, whose captivity and death were buried in the same secrecy that surrounded his missions? The evidence suggests the former. The mystery allows for the latter. Perhaps the most honest answer is this. Jerry Michael Shriver died in Southeast Asia on or shortly after April 24, 1969. Whether he died in combat or in captivity, quickly or slowly, we almost certainly will never know. What we do know is that he served with exceptional courage, that he became a legend among the warriors of MACV-SOG, and that his sacrifice was part of the larger sacrifice of more than 58,000 Americans who did not come home from Vietnam. His name is on the wall in Washington, Panel 01 East, Line 134, among thousands of others who gave everything. But unlike most of those names, Jerry Shriver's story did not end with his death. It continues in the retelling, in the questions that still get asked, in the veterans who still wonder what happened to their brother in arms. He became what every warrior fears and what some in their darkest moments desire. He became a ghost. Not metaphorically, literally. A person whose existence ended but whose story did not, who left the world of the living without ever fully entering the world of the dead. The jungle swallowed him, and the jungle kept him. If you believe in such things, maybe that is fitting. A warrior so committed to the fight that even death could not fully claim him. Forever 27, forever moving toward the enemy guns, forever surrounded from the inside. The truth is probably simpler and sadder. A good soldier who served too many tours, who pushed too hard for too long, who volunteered for one mission beyond his luck. A body left behind in hostile territory. A family that never got closure. A name on a wall that represents not just a death, but an unresolved disappearance. But simple truths do not capture what Jerry Shriver meant to the men who served with him. They do not explain why his story is still told decades later. They do not address the way certain lives burn so brightly and so briefly that they leave images burned into memory. Mad Dog Shriver was real. The missions were real. The combat was real. The disappearance was real. And the mystery remains real. In the end, we honor the fallen by remembering them, by telling their stories, by ensuring that their sacrifice is not forgotten. For the soldiers whose remains came home,